Chief Daniel Mercer had the kind of reputation that made people feel safe just by seeing him walk down the street. He was tall, sharp in his uniform, and carried himself with a sense of certainty that left little room for doubt. In Rosewood, a small town that prided itself on being close-knit and orderly, he was more than just the chief of police. He was a symbol. Parents pointed him out to their children as an example of what it meant to live honorably. Every ceremony, from parades to memorials, seemed to orbit around his presence. He gave speeches about duty, about sacrifice, about keeping the streets safe. People applauded, and no one questioned if those words matched the man who spoke them. Over 2 decades, Mercer collected medals and commendations, all carefully displayed on the walls of his office. Photographs showed him shaking hands with mayors, standing proudly at academy graduations, even smiling with children during community events. It was a carefully built image, polished like the shine on his badge. And it worked. Few men in Rosewood enjoyed such unshakable trust. He was the one neighbors called when something went wrong, the one reporters admired, the one politicians relied on. What nobody saw, what nobody dared even imagine, was the weight behind that mask of respect. Power had changed him. Slowly, quietly, he had learned the advantages of being the man everyone trusted most. He could shift the outcome of an investigation with a single word, bury a detail before it reached the wrong hands, and decide who was guilty long before a courtroom had its say. These choices started small, barely noticeable, but they grew bolder each year. By the time his picture hung in City Hall, Daniel Mercer was no longer the man people believed he was. It was a cold autumn evening when the town first felt something was wrong. A young woman named Emily Saunders never came home from her late shift at the diner. Her family reported her missing the very next morning, certain it was out of character. Rosewood was not a place where people simply disappeared. Yet when the case landed on Chief Mercer's desk, the urgency that should have followed seemed oddly muted. Patrol officers expected a swift search, interviews, and media alerts, but days passed with little progress. The file lingered, incomplete, with evidence left uncollected and notes strangely vague. Those who asked questions were told the case was being handled, but no one ever saw Mercer push it forward. Emily's disappearance began to stir whispers in the community. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances when her posters appeared on telephone poles. A few even questioned why Mercer appeared more irritated than determined whenever the case was mentioned. His statements to the press were short, dismissive, almost rehearsed. Something about his tone suggested he wanted the matter to fade rather than be solved. Inside the department, younger officers noticed irregularities they couldn't explain. Reports went missing from the system, and crucial witness statements never reached the official file. When one officer quietly raised concerns, he was suddenly transferred to traffic duty miles outside of town. Mercer's hand was everywhere, guiding the case into silence. For the public, Emily's disappearance was a tragedy without answers. For Mercer, it was the beginning of cracks forming in a carefully built facade. What no one could see yet was how closely her vanishing was tied to the double life he had been leading. A single missing woman had started to pull back the curtain on the chief's darkest secrets. As outside investigators began to look into Emily's disappearance, they quickly realized Rosewood was not as peaceful as its reputation suggested. The longer they examined the town's records, the more inconsistencies surfaced. Arrests for drug possession seemed to vanish before reaching court. Known troublemakers operated openly without fear of consequence. Businesses tied to suspicious activity never faced inspections or raids. At the center of each omission stood the same name, Chief Daniel Mercer. It became clear that Mercer had spent years transforming the police department into a tool for his own purposes. He was not simply turning a blind eye, he was orchestrating something far larger. The chief had quietly built relationships with criminal groups who trafficked drugs through Rosewood's highways. In exchange for bribes and loyalty, Mercer offered them safety. Evidence against them disappeared, rival dealers were conveniently targeted, and anyone who threatened the arrangement found themselves intimidated into silence. His officers either joined him willingly, fearing his disapproval, or found themselves pushed out of meaningful positions. What unsettled federal agents most was the level of planning. Mercer wasn't careless. He kept his network hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and fear. To the outside world, his department appeared efficient, but inside it functioned like a fortress, guarding secrets instead of solving crimes. Witnesses who might have spoken out grew too afraid, convinced the very people meant to protect them were working for the other side. By the time the investigators pieced together the pattern, Mercer had been running his empire for nearly a decade. He wasn't just complicit, he was the architect. Rosewood's trusted protector had been operating as its silent predator, controlling crime not to eliminate it, but to profit from it. The realization painted a terrifying picture of betrayal. For years, Mercer had managed to stay one step ahead of suspicion. Every investigation that brushed too close to him was quietly redirected or buried under paperwork. He relied on the loyalty of a few trusted officers and the fear he instilled in the rest. It seemed impossible that any mistake could reach him. But the downfall of powerful men often begins with something small, something overlooked. In Mercer's case, it was a set of surveillance tapes. The recordings were from a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a known hub for criminal exchanges. Mercer had ordered one of his officers to destroy the evidence after a late-night raid. The tapes, however, were misfiled during a chaotic shift and placed in storage alongside routine traffic footage. For months, they sat unnoticed until a federal audit required the evidence room to be cleared and catalogued. When agents reviewed the contents, the tapes revealed images Mercer never expected to see again. There he was, in full uniform, standing shoulder to shoulder with men tied to drug shipments and extortion rackets. The footage showed not only his presence but also moments where he appeared to give instructions, gesturing toward boxes that investigators later confirmed were filled with narcotics. His denial would mean nothing against the clarity of the recordings. The man who had always controlled the narrative could no longer shape what the cameras had captured. Mercer's empire unraveled quickly after that. Federal agents traced financial records, uncovering unexplained deposits linked to the same groups. Officers who had once protected him began to confess in exchange for leniency. Every secret he had buried was dragged into daylight. What had begun with a single clerical mistake now stood as the undeniable proof that the chief of police had been the criminal mastermind all along. On the morning of his arrest, Mercer sat alone in his office, surrounded by the relics of a career built on lies. The walls were lined with framed certificates, photographs, and medals that once told the story of an honorable life. Now, each plaque felt like evidence of his deception. The weight of silence filled the room as he stared at his badge resting on the desk. For years, it had been the shield that protected him, the symbol that made people trust his every word. Now it looked like nothing more than a piece of metal, powerless against the truth closing in around him. Outside the station, news crews gathered, their cameras waiting to capture the fall of the town's most respected man. Officers he had commanded avoided eye contact as whispers passed between them. Some were furious, others relieved, but all of them knew the story was over. The man who once embodied their department's pride had become its greatest disgrace. When federal agents stepped through the door, Mercer did not resist. He knew the fight had already been lost the moment those tapes surfaced. The courtroom would only confirm what he had already accepted in his heart, that every lie, every bribe, every crime he had hidden beneath his polished image had led him here. The jury would hear the evidence, the judge would deliver the sentence, and the people who once cheered for him would only remember betrayal. As he was led away in handcuffs, Mercer felt the finality of it settle in. There would be no redemption, no quiet retirement, no rewriting of history. His legacy was shattered, his freedom gone. In that moment, Daniel Mercer understood that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, a prisoner of the very justice he once pretended to save.